This is the 1920s, lesson 3, the Republican decade, including the Red Scare. You can see from this cartoon depicting the Red Scare of the 1920s. Very scary. A lot of mean-looking people grabbing a bunch of other people and taking them off, taking them away, taking them to someplace not so good. We'll explain what's going on in this cartoon, or with the people who are in this cartoon, a little bit later. But it is reflective of America's fears of communists and what was going on over in the Soviet Union and other parts of the world, and then how we interpreted it as a problem for us in this country. All right, first we have to talk about the Red Scare. This is dealing with the Russian Revolution. Russia had a whole situation going on during World War I in 1917, 1918, where the Russian workers and peasants were just tired of fighting, and they were tired of the political turmoil regarding their leadership. And then this guy came along, Vladimir Lenin. Lenin and his Bolsheviks were promising peace, land, and bread. And they overthrew the Russian government in November of 1917. The Bolsheviks means majority, even though they were the minority of the people. Kind of ironic that they got away with that. But Vladimir Lenin and his Bolsheviks are going to overthrow the government, and there's going to be a big civil war. Now, the problem with civil wars is that it's Russians killing Russians. You can see Vladimir Lenin there, and the red flag of communism behind him. So Vladimir Lenin shows up at a time that just happens to be perfect for World War I for the bad guys, for Germany. Because when they help him come to power in Russia, he promises to then pull Russia out of the war. Once he takes over Russia, he promises to pull them out of that side of the war. Well, if that's the case, then Germany doesn't have to fight a two-front war anymore, and it makes it very much more difficult on the British and the French. And this is also going to get the Americans to move a little bit quicker to try to get to that Western Front. We've talked about all this stuff previously, but we're just kind of reminding you. So as we said, there's a civil war that breaks out, and it turns out to be between Lenin's Red Army, red representing the blood of the people, the peasants, the working class, versus the White armies, which is the Tsar or the King's armies. And you can see the scene of just chaos in the streets during the Russian Revolution. So the Red Army was former landowners, government officials. The White Army was former landowners, government officials, Russian army leaders, and others. The White Army were the people who had something to lose in this revolution. They were the powerful people who had something to lose if this revolution were to happen. We, the United States, France, and Britain, had money, and other nations as well, had money invested in Russia, and had a lot to lose if the White Army were to lose. So we backed the White Army. Well, we were more concerned about World War I, so we eventually are going to lose this fight, and the Red Army wins in 1920. By 1922, Lenin has established a new nation called the USSR, or the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or just for short, the Soviet Union. Lenin will use the premise that Karl Marx had promoted in the 1800s, communism. He made the Soviet Union openly hostile toward American beliefs and values, because capitalism, private ownership of land and business, and our First Amendment freedoms that we have directly contradict the communist dictatorship that he's trying to promote over in the Soviet Union. So we are completely at odds with the Soviets just based alone on our economy and then our ideology. Now, if you don't know what communism means, just to give you a quick hit of communism here, it means that the government owns all land and all property, that there is only one single political party. Like in this country, we have Democrats and we have Republicans, and we have anything in between in terms of smaller political parties. There is only the Communist Party in the Soviet Union. And the needs of the country always took priority over the rights of you as individuals. Now, this doesn't work in a bubble. It only can work if it's able to spread around the world. And that's where our fear comes in. The Soviet Union's intention to spread communism around the world alarms many Americans, not only because we're afraid of our borders, but we're afraid of our, a lot of Americans at that time had European ancestry, or were, right, their family was in Europe at that time, and they had just come over from Europe. So they were afraid that the nations that their families still lived in were going to fall to communism. They were concerned that within the masses of European immigrants, communists were actually coming into the United States with all the increased numbers of communists in Europe. The fear was that they were coming into our country. Now, of course, newspapers and yellow journalism is what it is at this time frame. You're trying to sell newspapers, and fear sometimes does this. So newspapers sensationalize the fear. And this time frame in the 1920s becomes known as the Red Scare. It was called this for communists and other radicals, or they were calling for communists and other radicals to be jailed or driven out of the United States. So you can see some of this propaganda of the day. You see from this newspaper, the Red Bible, whatever that is, Council's Appeal to Violence, where they seized Bolshevist propaganda, guidelines, and world revolution. And this political cartoon saying that labor and labor unions were the first step toward this, and then strikes, and then disorder and riots, and then Bolshevism and murders leading to chaos. This was the fear that this was the order of operations in this kind of a revolution, and this could happen here. A famous court case from the day in the 1920s was Schenck v. United States. Okay, so during World War I, a man named Charles Schenck was mailing letters to men who were drafted, urging them not to report for duty. There is Charles Schenck. He was not happy that people were being drafted and forced to fight for their country. He was convicted of breaking what was called the Espionage Act. Now, I think we talked about the Espionage Act, but in case you forgot, it's a wartime law aimed at spies and people opposing the war. So basically, the United States government was saying that this Charles Schenck was breaking the Espionage Act by mailing letters to people who were being drafted to fight for this country. Schenck appealed, claiming his First Amendment right to free speech. And there is the Supreme Court from the mid-1920s during this court case. The Supreme Court rules that the government is justified in silencing free speech when there is a clear and present danger to the nation. You can say what you want, you just can't say something that's going to incite people to act, especially if it isn't true. You can see people were very passionate about this case and the potential that their First Amendment rights were being taken away from them. People get very uptight when you start messing with their First Amendment right of free speech. And the way that this is explained is or the easy way to try to explain this is like yelling fire in a crowded theater. You can't just come into a crowded area and yell fire. You have the First Amendment right to say what you want to say, but by yelling fire, you potentially create a situation where people panic. Uh, People may like almost have a mass like exodus or stampede out of an area. People may get trampled. You might have people with a heart attack or heart conditions, or something bad can happen. So yelling fire in a crowded theater may be your First Amendment right, but it's not a good thing to do. And therefore, in situations like that, your First Amendment right is not protected. Now, that opening cartoon that I showed you showed a giant figure there, rounding people up with the police behind them, with scooping people up in nets. That is reflective of this, the Palmer raids. Back in June of 1919, several bombs exploded in cities, and one of them damaged the home of A. Mitchell Palmer, who was the Attorney General of the United States. There's A. Mitchell Palmer. I've learned over my history teaching career to not trust anybody who goes by a first initial. You'll see as the course goes forward, anytime there's a guy with a first initial name, they tend to be shady. And he's got some shifty eyes, right? Look, get a good look there. A little shifty. Anyway, he was convinced that radicals were conspiring to overthrow the United States government, and that's who was in charge of setting off these bombs. The Justice Department, which is under A. Mitchell Palmer, the Attorney General, set up a special force to conduct raids and arrest people they considered to be subversives, people who are trying to overthrow the government. Now, he's not saying communists. He's not saying specifically what group this is. It's essentially leaving the door open for anyone who they feel might be trying to overthrow the government was a subversive. They would be charged with anarchy. And honestly, you really didn't need any real evidence. You just had to be charged with this to have a problem, because many of them were immigrants and were born overseas and didn't speak much English and really didn't have access to defending themselves. So they would be deported. So at first, people saw a benefit to this. This happens all the time. We panic because of a certain situation, and then we support the idea because it's going to keep us safer. But then we realize that when we don't know when they're going to come for us next. When all of a sudden it's going to be us that they're coming after. You can see this is one of the results of a Palmer raid. You see just stuff just thrown everywhere, looking for any evidence they could find of radicalism or the idea of overthrowing the U.S. government. And you can see the cover of the Ogden Standard. I have to cancel my subscription to this. Palmer declares alien Reds are to be deported. You can see there's actually 4 different headlines going on there. They read columns going down. Newspapers have changed a lot since the 1920s. 1919, I guess. This political cartoon sending back some Russian immigrants in the United States back to Russia. Uncle Sam sending them home, wishing Lenin a Merry Christmas. Palmer predicted that on May 1st, 1920, there would be general labor strikes and widespread bombings. So again, he's striking fear into these people, into the American people. And of course, the press, like I said, is going to jump all over this stuff. They love to publish things that are going to strike fear, because then it makes you buy more newspapers to find out what's going to happen next. Well, in the end, none of this ever did really happen. It never did materialize. Another big moment during the Red Scare was the arrest and eventual death of 2 Italian immigrants, Sacco and Vanzetti. In April of 1920, a gunmen, okay, plural, robbed and killed the guard and paymaster of a shoe factory in South Braintree, Massachusetts. 2 weeks later, 2 Italian immigrants were arrested for the crime, and that is Sacco and Vanzetti. Nicola Sacco was a shoemaker, and Bartolomeo Vanzetti was a fish peddler. He sold fish. Both of them were anarchists, and nobody questioned the fact that they were anarchists. Just because you are an anarchist and you believe in no government um, doesn't mean you're guilty of a crime, but at the time, it sure felt right. Sacco had a gun on him at the time, which was not uncommon, but it was the same model gun that was used in the crime that was committed in April of 1920. Many Americans believed that they were both arrested simply because they were immigrants who were radicals, and it was convenient and easy to arrest them for this crime. They really couldn't defend themselves, but this kind of took on a whole atmosphere where a lot of Americans were very upset about the way that this was treated. And you can see in this political cartoon, the area that they were arrested in outside of Boston is also an area that was famous for the Salem witch trials back in the 1600s. So you can see they're comparing what's happening to Sacco and Vanzetti as the witch trials. I mean, honestly, we know that there were no such thing as witches back in Salem in the 1600s, but it looked like an easy way out to blame these young girls for all the problems that people were having back in the 1600s. They were found guilty after a trial that many considered to be an unfair trial. And this was appealed many times, but their convictions were upheld every time. And they were sentenced to death by electric chair. And you can see, according to the Boston Daily Globe, there's actually three defendants here: Medeiros, Sacco, and Vanzetti all died in the chair that morning. And there they are in the Daily News, dead. Well, we've talked a lot about unions and labor situations here and related to the communist scare of the 1920s. A wave of labor strikes helped to fuel the Red Scare in 1919. So a labor strike is when you have a union of workers, could be anything, could be coal workers, could be factory workers, could be teachers, could be firemen, could be policemen who have a union, and they don't feel like what they're getting paid is the right amount. They don't feel like they get enough days off. They don't feel like they get enough health care. So a wave of labor strikes, again, fearing that this was leading toward potential communism, helped to fuel the Red Scare in 1919. Many Americans believed that communist agitators were behind this labor unrest, and that in 1919, other issues like soaring prices of food and inflation were also helping to create this problem. Most Americans opposed these strikes and saw them as anti-American and likely to result in violence. They distrusted labor unions and the immigrants that they were representing, assuming many of them to be radicals, even though they necessarily were not. The largest labor union at the time was the American Federation of Labor, or the AFL, who went out of its way to declare its opposition to radicalism and communism. So just because you were in a labor union and potentially could strike, it doesn't mean that you are anti-American or an anarchist. But that's what was happening at the time. Membership peaked during the Red Scare. Membership of unions peaked during the Red Scare. Well, also in the 1920s, we have a change in leadership from the Democrat Woodrow Wilson to Republicans. Americans felt that the Republicans could restore stability to the United States. Things had seemingly gotten out of hand in the 19-teens, and with the economy, with the war, with the pandemic of the Spanish flu, and Americans felt that a change of political party in our government maybe was the best thing, so they voted more Republican in the 1920s. And starting with the 1920 election, Republicans will dominate all three branches of the government. Presidents, the majority of Congress for most of the presidencies, and the Supreme Court appointments and rulings all seem to favor the Republicans. Starting with our 29th president, Warren G. Harding. First of all, his foreign policy looked similar to the foreign policy before the war. Americans wanted to go back to being isolated, and that's going to be his promotion. He's going to bring us back to being isolated, whereas Woodrow Wilson was trying to get us more involved with the League of Nations. Warren G. Harding was basically saying that we need to go back to minding our own business. He wanted peace and stability while carefully avoiding entangling alliances, because we saw that alliances was one of the things that started World War I. Called for disarmament, which was a program in which nations of the world would voluntarily give up their weapons, which is a tough thing to ask people to do because, I mean, you can't take away the right of a nation to defend themselves. If you take away their weapons, you make them vulnerable to attack. We continue to engage in trade throughout the world. We're going to ask nations to give up their weapons, but we're not going to give up ours, for the record. Now, we were now a major economic power, and we wanted to make sure we had trade partners all over the world. We promoted the expansion of trade while protecting our businesses at home with tariffs, making sure that American goods could be sold at a lower rate than imported goods, which frustrated European nations because the European nations are trying to pay off their war debt to the United States, and they can't make any money if we keep jacking up the prices that they're going to have to, that Americans would pay for their goods. He also signed the Dawes Plan with our allies, giving Germany a payment schedule for reparations. Even though Germany has no money to pay them back, we're going to try to set this plan up. Domestically, Harding had some things to deal with. Americans became more nativist, which means that they favored native-born Americans over immigrants. Again, we were not real friendly with immigrants simply because even though many of the people within our country were immigrants and were first or second generation off the boat immigrants, the fear of communism was really was real at the time. Well, they believed that foreigners were not going to be fully loyal to the United States as well. So patriotism was one of the reasons. Religion. Americans were mostly Protestants, and they did not trust Catholics, Jews, and others who were coming into this country. Urban conditions. The cities were overcrowded as it was, and a lot of these immigrants were coming in and moving into those cities. Jobs. There weren't a lot of jobs to go around, and now you've got unemployed immigrants coming in looking for jobs and willing to take jobs at a lower pay than you were willing to take jobs. And of course, the Red Scare, the communist thing that we talked about before. 1921, Congress passed a law restricting immigration, which set quotas or numerical limits on certain immigrants, on certain groups of immigrants from certain parts of the world because of the fear of potential communism. Now, this was a temporary thing. But the National Origins Act of 1924 will reduce that quota to only 2%. You can see previous to the National Origins Act, only allowing so many in. Well, Warren G. Harding had a problem. One of his problems was called the Teapot Dome scandal. At the start of 1923, the economy was growing, and Harding was a very popular president. However, major corruption scandals in his administration were being exposed. Now, Harding himself was not directly involved, but the worst of the scandals of the people that were around him was called the Teapot Dome scandal, where members of his administration took bribes for oil drilling rights on government land. Now, one of which was in Teapot Dome, Wyoming. The stress of the scandals probably contributed to his death in August of 1923. And when he dies in 1923, we end up with a new president, number 30, Calvin Coolidge. And you can see this political cartoon and the oil scandal with the Teapot Dome top of the steamroller. So Vice President Calvin Coolidge was sworn in by his father, who was a justice of the peace, as soon as word arrived of Harding's death. And like I said, he becomes our 30th president of the United States. Now, he had no part in the scandals either. He was clean as well. And after finishing Harding's term, he ran for and won the presidency in 1924. So he will continue to be president of the United States. One of the things that he promoted, along with Harding, was something called laissez-faire. which essentially means that the chief business of the American people is business. And he felt that the government should keep its hands off business and allow business to make money, because if businesses make money, and the government does not get involved in those businesses, then business can succeed, businesses make money, businesses hire people, rates go, pay goes up, business expands, and it's good for everyone. This approach will help to fuel the tremendous economic boom of the 1920s. We'll call this the Roaring Twenties. You can see big business celebrating there on bags of money representing all different things. Excuse me. One other thing during the Coolidge presidency was called the Kellogg-Briand Pact, continuing the isolationism and ideas of his international issues. He was promoting peace and stability without getting involved in other nations. Now, he left most of his foreign policy decisions to his Secretary of State, Frank Kellogg. And he worked out a deal with French Foreign Minister Briand, suggesting that they agreed not to declare war on each other. And they were able to get a number of other nations involved in the deal as well, agreeing not to declare war on each other. And that makes your life a lot easier in terms of working out deals when you know that you don't have the threat of war hanging over. The pact was unrealistic and had no real provisions for enforcement, but it was a feel-good thing at the time. There they are signing the Kellogg-Briand Pact. Okay, we'll continue with lesson 4 of the 1920s in a few days. Take care.